not like 30. Excuse me. So anyway, that's the surface thing of Vatican II. I think the idea that we are all the people of God that comes out of Vatican II is a really formative thing. Excuse me. I'm talking too much, you see. And anyway, I thought I'd want to open up here and have your impressions as people, probably in many cases, I can't see everybody, in many cases probably were alive at that time. How you see church as a result of that and how it's affected your view of everything, history, but life in general.
Well,
Go ahead,
I
Kathleen.
was going to say my grandparents were married in 1910. My both of my grandmothers were Irish Catholics. Both of my grandfathers on both sides were German Lutherans in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So that did not bode well for either side. And my mother's parents had to get married at 6:30 in the morning in the rectory without benefit of a fancy wedding because the minister was opposed to it and the priest was opposed to it. And when I came up in the 60s, I went to Catholic school, and I remember the sisters telling us the Jews killed Jesus,
Mm.
you know, and I had Jewish relatives, and I'm like, it never made sense to me. And you couldn't go in the Protestant church across the street. When we finally could, I graduated in 67 from grade school. So they started when I was in grade school and high school is when the changes started. And when we finally had a little bit of ecumenism for Christmas Eve, the Episcopal church across the street opened up on Christmas Eve so we could have, because we had so many people going to church back then, so we could use their church for Catholic Mass. And we all wanted to go just to see what it looked like inside because we were taught that, like bolt of lightning would strike you dead if you went in a Protestant church. So, when I came to St. Vincent's 30 years ago, it was such a refreshing, it was a totally different perception of church and how God looks at, the connection between the people and God. I was raised by Augustinians who told us everything was, God, like God was looking down on us with a checklist. And I came to St. Vincent's where Bishop McGinney and Father Leo had been at Vatican II. They were participants in Vatican II. And, God loves you. And all of the things were implemented before a lot of churches were doing them.
Mm. I remember similar stories. One was one of the sisters told us, we don't know for sure that anyone has ever gone to hell, but we're pretty sure Judas and Martin Luther. And then the other one, they told us that there was a thing that like kind of went along with the Baltimore Catechism, and they have stories on this. Mary and Susan were friends. Mary, of course, was Catholic. Susan was a Lutheran. Mary told Susan, "You have to become a Catholic, or you risk going to hell." Susan didn't listen and got hit by a truck. What happened to her? She went to hell. And one day we were told to pray hard if one of our parents was a Protestant that they convert before they die. And later on, I thought some of the stuff we were told, and it wasn't a lot of it official stuff. It was sort of like popular religion, I guess. We'd have the May crownings, and we were told to go out on the lawn. And it was real hot, and we passed out. That was good. It would be a good. It'll be a good witness to the Protestants. And I thought the only good witness that would be is that the Catholics are crazy giving their kids sunstroke. But at that time, it's sort of, you just sort of thought these things without any kind of reflection. And then to me, the Vatican Council opened up the floodgates for people to start thinking about things on their own and maybe being treated more as adults, which is another reason I thought this is the adult phase of the church, at least in possibility.
Um, I'm pro so like I'm 38, so I'm probably like one of the youngest people here on this call. And I just have very conflicting feelings. The first time I went to a Latin mass, I was just like floored by the beauty of it and all the just like the tradition and
Mhm.
like how I mean the beauty of the church, the beauty of the ceremony, and I was just like, why, how could anybody want to give this up? And I have friends that are like very traditional, like hardcore, like Vatican II is the worst thing ever,
Mhm.
Catholics. And then I have Catholic friends that are like very progressive and think like Vatican II is like the greatest thing ever. And I feel like personally, like I don't understand why like the two to me, I love the beauty and the reverence of the old mass.
Mhm.
But I also like the focus on like, kind of more on like the social aspects that maybe the church historically didn't have so much focus on in the past. And I don't really understand like why like to ha like if you want to have beautiful churches and beautiful liturgies, like you have to have support like very like old school theology. But then like in general, like the people that support like more progressive theology, like don't care about that beauty. And then another little thing about the changes in Vatican II that kind of bothered me was one time I was like on a trip somewhere and the only mass that I could get to was it was in Spanish and so like somebody said on the way when I was walking in, he was like, this mass is in Spanish. And I said, yeah, I'm okay with that. And it just kind of like made me a little sad that like now that it's not all in one language, like we kind of def as Catholics when we're at Mass, we're dividing ourselves like into different groups. And like it's totally fine, like if you want to have like like a Hispanic ministry or like celebrate your culture. But I feel like at Mass, like we should all just be Catholics and not like divide ourselves like that. And so I feel like that, like having it in Latin, like I can understand like both sides of having it in Latin versus the vernacular, but I don't like the way that it kind of divided us.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And I could go on, but I won't because,
Okay.
time. Thanks for
I really,
listening.
I'm glad you brought up these things because this is something I'm more and more aware of. I think we have a problem with so-called liberals and conservatives in the church and causing divisions that I don't think we need to have. My theory is that people like yourself were younger that grew up after the Second Vatican Council. Um, you never experienced the things beforehand, and today and in our day, in the old days, you had certain things that everybody knew you were Catholic. Not eating meat on Friday, having mass in Latin. Women would wear veils on their head. I remember, and then it gave you a sense of being, oh, okay, this is what it means to be a Catholic. All these little things, and now people who are maybe several generations removed, what does it mean to be Catholic? And they sometimes look for these external things. I have a friend who's very liberal theologically and politically, but thinks we should go back to Latin Mass because, except for the homily and things like that, because everybody in the world is using the same language. And in some ways, to me, that's the same as going to Mass in Spanish. Everybody in that congregation is using um, a language together. And one of the things I think is kind of funny is in the old days, we had all these ethnic parishes, French churches, German churches, Irish churches, but they were all having Mass in Latin, which is kind of funny when you think about it now. Um, but I think we have to sometimes be more tolerant of each other. I
Mm.
love a Latin Mass when it's done beautifully and well. I like an Eastern Rite Mass. Uh, Unfortunately, I think also people romanticize Latin Mass. A friend of mine who was an Episcopalian became a Catholic, and he wanted to go to a Latin Mass, and he called it the Mumble Mass. He said it was awful. The priest was mumbling, and then just altar service, nobody else knew what was going on. And so the Latin Mass at its best, if you look at it on a video, it's just beautiful, but it wasn't always that beautifully performed, if that's the right word. in the old days. But I think we have to be more tolerant of each other in terms of these things that aren't really essential, but also talk about things that maybe are essential instead of getting hung up on the externals. And to me, that it seems like that's something I'm more aware of. Being patient, like with some of the students, I find they have two extremes. One group is just away from religion completely. They've just given up on churches and religion. The other group that become Catholic sometimes strike one as very rigid and authoritarian and conservative. But I think for many of them, it's just a way of expressing their Catholicism because they've never had it naturally expressed the way some of us did who were older, if that makes sense.
One thing I
Thanks.
would like to add, Father Dan, I think, I understand the concern about the Latin versus English. My thrust in terms of Vatican II is the importance of the people of God. Now, the liturgy, Latin versus the vernacular, I understand the concern she was expressing, but I think the importance is that everyone, that there's an understanding that the clergy and the laity are on the same level, that they have different vocations and they have contribute their different gifts to the church and that what I think Pope Francis started in pushing the synod and also involving the laity, I think is an incredibly important step for the church in terms of having that the responsibility is the entire church, both lay and clergy, in making decisions. I have kind of a bias on this. My wife is a Methodist pastor, and the Methodist Church elect their bishops, and everything they do is all their bodies are elected as half clergy and half laity. And so that's what I got out of what a Vatican II is important for me is that the laity are as much of a part of the church as the clergy. People do different roles, and that the authority needs to be disseminated more equally. And I think the process of the synod is something that may move us in that direction.
Mm-hmm. I think a key part in that is baptism. Baptism is the sacrament.
Yeah. I wonder if, and I don't remember people I'm in my early 70s, they really didn't, at least the church I went to, they really didn't explain the reason for the changes, like the liturgical reasons for the changes when they turned the altar around. And I remember all the older people being all kind of upset. But I felt like you said, we who grew up in that old, it was rigid. It was beautiful, but it was very rigid. And you kind of went to mass. You didn't participate in mass. You kind of went and sat there through mass and listened to the homily and sang the songs in Latin. And when you learned how to read, you read the English part. I think, if we went in high school and in college, really when I went to St. Rose was the first time I had any real classes in theology that explained any of that, like what those transitions, how they came to be and why they were made. And I think maybe we need to better educate people about that transition period and the difference between like the religious sisters. I don't know the difference between the friars. They went around in street clothes when they weren't at church before Vatican II. But like the sisters who now don't wear habits, they're out doing what their original founders were doing. And, there's a reason that they switched back to street clothes. And if you don't talk to them, people don't know that. So that's.
So I was an altar boy, born in '53. I was an altar boy before Vatican II, and of course, we had to do the responses to the priest, and I didn't even know what they meant really, even though there was probably a translation in the thing we learned. In fact, I was well into my adulthood before I realize that it wasn't et cum spirit 220. I thought it was spirit 220, you know, and then and also with you. And the thing about Vatican II for me was just openness. I don't know if I'm wrong in thinking the word aggiornamento, but just openness to respecting and working with uh, you know, other Christian religions, non-Christian religions, and the openness of and accessibility of uh, the Bible and the meaning of things. Learn, you know, a liturgical, you know, teaching mass and those kind of things help you really learn what everything meant. So I think that the openness, uh, accessibility, and openness were important to me.
I think that one of the things that's happened that there's things that happen that we don't even realize because liturgy affects our thinking, I think. And I think I say the word God, it doesn't mean the same thing to me now as it did in my youth.
Mhm.
Not that God has changed, but my way of thinking has changed. So I joke about it in this way. When the friars would say prayers, they'll start out with good and gracious God. And I jokingly say, whatever happened to the mean and vindictive God we used to have? And it's not that God was mean and vindictive, but I think our image of God is maybe become less fearful. But
Mhm.
there's different personality types, and some people like more authoritarian people telling them what to do. I've had one or two occasions in the confessional where I think people got mad at me because I wasn't harsh enough with them. But you know, to me that doesn't make sense. But I think there are some people that they don't like living in gray. They like black and white, and every little detail has to be spelled out. Other people are maybe the other extreme, where you know, I remember they tell me that before I became a friar, they were experimenting at morning prayer, and instead of using the traditional prayers, one morning they just all gave each other glasses of orange juice and said good morning, and that was morning prayer. And I think it's all it's none of it's that serious, except I think we probably have different we think about these things differently than we did in the past, and there's no way to avoid that. It's just if you read that book in the 70s called Future Shock, one of the things I think people are having trouble with is change comes so quickly, and it's not just in church, it's everywhere. But how do you cope with that? It's some of it's technology, some of it's politics, some of it's whatever, and you think you've got everything figured out about your life, and then the whole thing gets up and ended over and over again. And I don't know. I think it requires more communication, not just between clergy and laity, but between everybody in the church.
Mhm.
I have a question for people. What are your perceptions of the impact of the clergy sexual abuse crisis on within the church, among the people you know, that sort of thing, about the impact upon the church?
I would say that it has had a great impact in at least my personal family. My siblings, we all grew up in Troy. We went to, all of us did, except my youngest sister, did 12 years at Catholic school. My parents very bigly embraced the Vatican II movement. My father got on the parish council. He read at church on Sunday. He became a Eucharistic minister and was very devout to that. And to step further in the future and find we personally never anybody had any problems with priests or any other clergy or teachers. To know that that happened was very disheartening for us. And my husband, my one brother have, left the church, and my cousins, and the non-women priest, certainly that's a giant discussion in our house, but and my oldest son was very, very involved, and we lived in Ohio in his youth group. He was in the music ministry. And when that all came out, he decided not to be confirmed. So that was hurtful to me. But then again, I could understand him and his father's position on it, because my husband saw the list of names of priests. We were in Ohio. He saw the list of people from New York, and he knew some of them. So it was very, very difficult. Very difficult.
I'm finding that it's kind of with my Protestant friends, they just all have this opinion that, oh, priests are like that, and they kind of wash everybody with the same brush, and that's what they see, and that's upsetting to me. It makes me feel like kind of a pariah with them sometimes, that no, it's not that way. It's not. But that's the way they feel.
I actually stopped going to church for a while because I worked when it first happened in 2020. I was teaching in a building right next to the pastoral center, and I taught kids who were sexually abused, many of them emotionally disturbed kids. And I found out that more than one priest that I knew by name who had been accused was working in the building that my kids went to for meetings. And there are 4 or 5 schools. So I kind of lost my mind, and I wrote the bishop a letter. Bishop Hubbard grew up with my aunts and uncles. I got summoned to the bishop's office because of the letter I wrote. And we had a discussion, Father Doyle and Bishop Hubbard and I, and we agreed to disagree on a lot of it. And I thought it had been resolved. Everything he told me in our conversation came out a couple of months later in 2002, I think it was. And then to find out, more recently when he did his deposition, and there's the church was still fighting those victims. I was like, I love St. Vincent's, and I said, I can't go for months. Like, I can't be a part of a church that accepts that, and fights the victims. And I went back because I missed the people, and that it's not every priest, but people, it's really hard for, it's not something that goes away to the victims. And I think people don't understand that if they haven't experienced that situation with someone.
Yeah. I think it's such a hard issue in so many ways. It's such a horrendous issue in the church. I think somebody once said, the church is like the canary in the coal mine. And when you look at our whole society right now and the abuse that's in the news, you start to find it everywhere. And it's almost like and I'm not saying that to justify the church. I think the church should be even more careful is not the right word, but the church should be even more insistent on not having this kind of thing go on. But I think that it points to a bigger problem that we have as a society. And I still haven't quite figured out the root cause of it. And then there are cases where, I've talked to priests who've been accused. And I remember one of them telling me something about what he was accused of. And I remember saying, wait a minute, how could that be, what you just told me? Because they accuse you of abusing their child who they left at your house overnight at the age of 10. I said, how'd this 10-year-old get to your house and why was he there? And it was kind of like, you don't know after a while, and you know that people who do abuse can be very convincing. And sometimes you don't know when somebody makes a denial. I don't know whether to believe them or not. And you feel bad that you don't, and you feel bad that you do. So it's a tough thing, and it does change. As a priest, the public reaction I got early on changed dramatically, I think, not so much personally, but in some extent, after the abuse crisis began. And you can never blame the victims. I think that that's an important thing to keep in mind. But it's very hard to know sometimes how to move forward, and how to move forward beyond being more careful. And I was what's called the visitor to the Irish friars, and they have a big problem with this. And I had to meet one of the friars who actually had been in prison and was in a nursing home type situation, and just would not admit that he'd done anything wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And just was kind of oblivious to it. And I got to see what a psychological sickness it is.
Mhm.
But on the other hand, you look at all the attempts to stop it, and you begin to wonder, well, has this been going on for centuries, or is this a 20th century phenomenon, or why are we experiencing this now? And I've had different theories, but they come and go, and it doesn't really solve anything.
Mm-hmm.
So it's sometimes you have to ask yourself, well, do I stay or do I go? And do I stay because of, or do I go because of this? Or do I still feel that there's a reason the church is more than just the sinfulness of the clergy or whoever in the church authorities doing these things?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I'm not making much sense because I still struggle with the whole thing myself.
Yeah, I had some, understanding, just having worked in the church, the things that I remember from, I think it was like the early 2000s. It just seemed like I regularly heard of people that were priests that were going to some kind of rehabilitation thing, and then they were supposedly rehabilitated and just put back in parishes. And you wonder where the research on pedophilia had been going on. You wonder how that ever would have come about. But anyway, the despite the deep disappointments that I felt because of priests that I knew, it just comes down for me, the the people in the parish that I belong to, I'm bonded with, and I wouldn't think of going anywhere else because of them. And I know what their faith is, and we've been lucky in our parish to have, priests that are not doing anything inappropriate. So it restores your faith.
I have to say, I very long time ago realized that my relationship with God had nothing to do with the priest on the altar.
Mm-hmm.
That I got what I got from sermons and classes like this, or my theology classes in college, but it was never related to a priest. So my husband felt differently on that, but I just never did. I had some good priests growing up, some questionable ones that I always thought were a little weird. I had a really wacky guy in college. So you just learn they're people. They make mistakes. They do things wrong. My opinion is the bishops and the hierarchy are like a corporation. They have their favorites. They take care of them. And that's where I feel there's a lot of work to be done. And I hope the new Pope is up for it, because I think that's the key to getting things straightened out, in my opinion. I mean, people may think differently, but. And I always liked the churches that I've gone to because of my fellow members of the church.
Mm-hmm.
It's a little bit off this topic, but when I've been to the Vatican a couple times and went to Mass in Latin or Italian or whatever, what it makes it a moving religious experience for me is not so much whether I see the Pope or somebody, it's the people that are there from all over the world.
Mm.
And you have this sense of we're all part of the same body, whether we're Nigerians or Americans or Russian or Ukrainian or Canadian or whatever. And there's something about, like you said, the other people. And sometimes the clergy are part of the people, and sometimes they're not in one way. I agree that the bishops are a key group that requires some study, I think, and some looking after. And I've met some bishops who are wonderful people. I think some bishops in the 70s and 80s, before they had the information, really thought that people could be sent away and be cured. And then I think from what we've learned since then, it's not the case for somebody who's really a pedophile. And so I think it's going to take a long time of healing, and it's going to take actions that are most important at the top level. And I'm not, I like you said, I don't know if I'd want to be in the Pope's shoes, just trying to deal with this on a worldwide level.
When I asked my friends why they don't go to mass, they said it's the abuse, but it's also the way the church treats women. You know,
Mhm.
so that's where like, because like my friends, I meet them after church. Like they don't go to church with me, but I'll meet up with them on a Saturday night, and we grew up together. And I'll say, "Do you want to go with me some night, like to my church?" And they're like, "No." And then I asked them why they don't go, and they told me because we're all friends. And they said, besides the abuse, it's the way that they treat women, how they dismiss us. And I said, well, they don't do that at my church. So, I mean, my church is fine, but as a corporation, it's not. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree.
Yeah.
Because like I wouldn't work for a corporation that didn't promote me.
On New York State's lands, the beautiful forests, the breathtaking waterfalls, finding
Somebody had something.
I don't know what that was, a TV.
You talk about Vatican II and the Latin Mass and all that. When I went away to college, it was an all-women's Catholic college in Boston, and they didn't have altar boys. So being good at Latin and having a brother who was an altar boy, I got to do the responses and be the altar girl. But I had to stay outside the communion rail and kneel there. But I felt so proud to finally be able to do something.
That's how I felt at St. Vincent's. One time they asked me to do the collection. And I said, I've been waiting since I was 6 years old. Girls do the collection. My sister Lisa and I wanted to do that collection so badly. And finally, we grew up and we did.
Someone mentioned about the issue of the Jackers about the issue of women. I went to a seminar they had at the Hubbard Center about probably 6 or 7 years ago at this point by now, and they were talking about the issue, the ordination of women as priests. And one of the panelists said he knew he was going to this, so he mentioned this to his daughter that he was going to go to this conversation about the ordination of priest. His daughter's reaction: "You guys are still talking about that stuff?" It wasn't anger. It wasn't anger. It was dismissal. It was basically, what century are you in? It was not that they had gone past that. The rest of society has said women are actively involved in most if most religious congregations can be actively involved. And the Catholic Church has not decided, still does not do that, and it's a matter of basically feeling dismissed. And
Right, I feel
that is
dismissed.
very major alienation of many women from the church, and I understand that perfectly.
I think one of the things that is going on right now is, and people take it from all different angles, is the appointment of a woman as the Archbishop of Canterbury in the Anglican Church. And I joke sometimes with Episcopalian friends of mine that I love your church, and they say, why? And I say, you're our research and development department. We try things out in the Episcopal Church to see if they're going to work. But I think it's going to be interesting to see what happens to the Church of England in particular, but to worldwide Anglicanism, and how do they resolve it. But it doesn't really answer the question, but it does give us a sort of insight in looking as outsiders but insiders and saying, okay, they're doing this what's it mean for them, and how do they react, and can we learn from it?
Right. Well, I wouldn't work for a company that wouldn't promote me, but every Sunday I go to church that wouldn't promote me, that dismisses me. And I don't know. I sometimes I sit back and I go, what am I doing? But I love my church, so I keep going, I guess. I don't know
One of
what
my cousins is a very conservative woman, and she said, not only do I want a woman priest, she said, I would never go to a woman doctor or a woman lawyer, and I was like shocked. I said, are you sure we're
Oh.
genetically related?
Ah,
Is the synod, do you think, Father, are they, like, I know from what I've read across the world in other countries, they're taking it seriously and really listening to the people. Are the American bishops really doing that? Because I think the role of women is going to be critical in the next 50 years. I have friends who have one woman I used to, actually two, that I worked with for years, who one runs an American Catholic church in Florida. She's the minister. Her husband was a Protestant minister, but she was ordained a woman priest. And another woman I worked with is a social worker. She and her female partner, they're married, are the two of them are women priests. I think and one of our deacons, his daughter is a Protestant minister because she couldn't be a priest.
Well, I
She
think
wanted to be a priest.
one of the interesting things to look at, I don't know much about the new bishop, but apparently what he was working on in Boston was a program called Listening to Women. And that's what he's been doing until just now when he's appointed Bishop of Albany. So be interesting to see what that means. And not that any one bishop can change the whole church, but I think hopefully he's one of many who will listen and try to do what they can. I as a friar, I feel sometimes out of the diocesan loop because we tend to not be we're under bishops when we're in their territory, but not really. It's like we're kind of outside the system in one sense. But I don't know. It's going to be interesting, and it's going to be well. I do have this feeling too about there's the cultural differences. When I was first a priest, or not even a priest yet, I was going to be ordained, and in theology school we had women, and they were very strong on believing in women's ordination. And I was in Jamaica, and I was talking to a women's group, and I mentioned it. They burst out laughing hysterically. So, Father, women can't be priests, and just a brother, I think it was at the time. And I realized I used to say, it wouldn't be fun to be Pope. And I said, no, it wouldn't be, because you have to deal with Americans, but you also have to deal with Jamaica, where these women are, rightly or wrongly, thinking this is a hysterically silly idea. And so, the world changes, maybe even Jamaica changes. But I think sometimes it's hard to look beyond our own culture to the whole worldwide situation. And I think Rome also particularly doesn't want to upset the apple cart with the Orthodox. It's like we tend to think of the Protestants as our dialogue partners. I think they're always looking to the Orthodox. And so I'm not saying that's right or wrong or how we decide the question, but I think it's complicated from the point of view of listening to all the voices, and including some of the most anti-ordination people I know are women. So it's hard to as a man, you don't want to say, well, you're wrong, you should be get ordained, but which is not I don't mean seriously that you necessarily should be ordained, but it's like it's become such a in some ways a complex thing, yet it seems like it should be a simple thing.
I have to comment that it was probably 20 years ago. My cousin's daughters both became altar servers down in New Rochelle. And the older one, she's 35 now, but she did it for a couple of years. And then she asked the priest, am I going to get to be a priest someday? And he said, no, dear, I'm really sorry. but you could be a Eucharistic minister and you could be a nun and you could be this. She quit. She said, how can they have me do it? Why are we altar servers if we're never going to get to do anything else, really? And so I think there's a whole generation that we've lost. We've lost.
I think also there's a question of priesthood itself. What does it mean? Because you don't want women who just buy into a clericalism that men have. You want to change the whole idea of priesthood first and then say, okay, this is the priesthood we're talking about. Or I'm not saying first necessarily in time, but it's maybe has to go on simultaneously, because this very clerical, I mean, I'm a priest, but I get turned off by clericalism, something fierce. And it just is hard for me to, it's like some people, not by any means all, some people become permanent deacons, become more clerical than the priests. And it's like, I think that's a whole nother issue of clericalism. And it gets back to your idea of the people of God. And we have, sorry, my light goes off if I don't wave my hands once in a while. But anyway, that doesn't solve anything, but it just is, I'm glad to hear people talking and thinking.
Sure. Anything else that people would like to add at this point? I thank Father Dan for everything that he's provided us in the 3 sessions. And if you have other thoughts about what we might do in terms of adult faith formation, feel free to, we'll do our annual survey again in the spring. But this has been a very educational and a enjoyable time, these 3 sessions.
And I'm sorry to rush through all these centuries so quickly with just to mention this or that, but it's, you want to just mention them and move on sometimes. Also, if she's still there, I want to say hello to Ann Conway, who's a friend of mine. I noticed she's there tonight. And I don't know if you're still there, Ann, but
I saw she had left.
Maybe
like
she
2
left.
minutes ago.
His brother's one of our friars.
Sure. Well, thank you very much, folks, and have a good night.
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah,
thank you guys for putting this on.
Getting over the same